Alright, what's up guys? Hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. So what are some things that we need to consider before we even think about having a central bank digital currency, right? So this is kind of the question we're trying to answer from this report from a series. It was a collaboration of multiple different central banks, um, like, for example, the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve. The BIS was in there. I know they're not kind of a sovereign central bank, but still, um, things like that, right? They were all kind of collaborating. And what did they come up with? This is from a discussion paper, right? So we'll discuss it. And they gave 7 or 8 different considerations that they were thinking about. Let's see, at least 7 different sections here in this report. But anyways, we'll head straight over to a screen share to the report, because keep in mind, one of the things that I've noticed is a big problem for a lot of people whenever they talk about or start talking about central bank digital currencies. I'll make it bigger so it's easier to see. Is privacy, which we'll get into in a second, but we'll try to take it in order because I like to go down rabbit holes for some reason. So we're going to try to keep it streamlined and not waste anyone's time. But anyways, so starting off with, system designs would likely differ between jurisdictions as central banks make choices that best suit their circumstances. Obviously, I mean, it's a central bank digital currency, so it seems like that would be rather case by case for that kind of sovereign entity zone case. So each country would have a different, each country has a different cost benefit analysis that they need to do for a central bank digital currency. Like there's different attributes that would work better for some rather than others, and then like how would that work, right? It's very much so a case by case basis, right? So each one will be different, and that's why the question of interoperability is such a big one that you see in these reports, right? So, these include motivations previously outlined by central banks, and this includes continued access to central bank money, resilience. This is resilience of the ecosystem in general and of the currency, and then also increased payments diversity, encouraging financial inclusion, improving cross border payments, and supporting privacy and facilitating fiscal transfers. So, from that, you can probably guess where it's going. But anyways, we're going to start one by one. So, additional access to central bank money. So, basically, they want people to have access to it. I mean, if you're going to make a currency, the whole point of a currency is for it to be transacted, right? So, if no one's using it, it's pointless. And so, from there, you kind of need to make people want to use it, for one. And with that being said, there's also a bunch of services that need to happen, right? That would make this work. Like there has to be payments have to be processed, billing has to be involved, um, things like that, right? And we touched on this in the last night's video on different elements of the core infrastructure and also kind of a broader ecosystem in general. And so that's I'll probably link that one in the description since it's pretty applicable to this video as well. But anyways, so with those services and stuff, one of the things that they talked about and that we talked about in the previous video, um, was basically how this ecosystem would essentially be two-tiered, where you have kind of the central bank entity, and then you have kind of intermediaries below them, to where basically the central bank outsources different like services and products to those intermediaries, whether they be banks, payment service providers, or whatever, right? And so now those intermediaries are most likely, and as they explicitly stated, should be, or well, they explicitly stated that they would like them to be, but not necessarily have to be, private entities, right? So private banks and then payment service providers, they're not government entities, right? And so that being said, for a private entity to want to participate, you kind of have to incentivize them in some form or fashion. There has to be some incentive for them there, right? Whether it be profit, whether it be, I don't know, tax cuts, or I'm completely lost the term that's used for it for some reason. Anyways, um, so you have to encourage them to do this, right? They have to. There's has to be something in it for them, and that's how you essentially get improvement and innovation within a system. What a thought! But anyways, um, they're talking about here, if there's a lack of interest in some form, whatever service that may be, or at some point in that kind of broader ecosystem, the central bank could step in, right? And they could create some entity to do it for them. Um, with that being said, there are certain things to where it obviously would be very suboptimal. Um, say like customer service that they even explicitly state. They even talked about nearing the beginning of this report, right? And so this is something even they agree with. So there's certain things that they just can't do, or probably shouldn't do. Um, Also, so if the central bank were to play too operational or dominant a role in the ecosystem, private intermediary participation could be curtailed with a reduction in the diversity, innovation, and efficiency of the system, potentially also giving rise to legal and constitutional questions. Okay, so why would those questions not arise anyway? But I guess that's some nuances that we don't want to go into in this video. I think you could kind of I needed to look more into that specifically to give more specific examples, and so I don't want to kind of go down that hole to where I don't have enough knowledge. At least I don't think I have enough knowledge to really give it a good argument, right? So we're going to continue on with this. So the second kind of characteristic or whatever was resilience. And so basically enhancing a jurisdiction's broader operational resilience could be achieved through a CBDC system acting as an additional payment method. That's one thing we talked about in previous videos was um, a central bank digital currency would most likely be auxiliary to the things we already have, be that with physical cash, with commercial bank deposits, with treasuries, whatever, right? It'd just be a dollar denominated central bank digital currency, right? Some Fed coin or whatever, right? So a CBDC system itself would need to be resilient to technical failure, counterfeiting, and cyber risks, all things we've talked about before. And such a system operated solely by the central bank with elements independent of pre existing payment infrastructure could continue to operate if those systems fail. Basically, it'd be a backup system, right? And so, if, say, one of the private entity system that they're talking about for the pre existing payment infrastructure, right, was to fail, you would still have the central bank digital cur- currency to fall back on, right? To where it basically gives one more kind of alternative to transferring value, right? Is kind of, it seems like it's their argument here. So, designing a system in this way would, however, be a significant undertaking, and the resilience benefits would need to be assessed against the costs in the broader context of the resilience of existing domestic payment systems. So, basically, if they were to do this, would it be detrimental to the current systems that we already have? And what would be the overall kind of development of the financial system in general? Because we know, especially for for central banks, financial stability is kind of arguably the only reason they're there, right? The whole reason they exist, right? At least from the horse's mouth, right, so to speak. Um, Okay, so beyond the core system, the broader ecosystem could share processing infrastructure with other payment systems. Yet, if this failed or was compromised, it could undermine both systems' availability at the same time. Basically, would it be better for them to have separate systems, right? Like we kind of talked about just previously, or kind of combining them in some way, the share processing that they could share processing infrastructure, right? So, would it be beneficial to really diversify the kind of infrastructure itself, right? And so now they're talking about like parallel processing infrastructure, where it's kind of the same thing. They have duplicate functions, but they don't share anything. So if one system goes down, you still have an alternative, right? But then you also have to be able to convert between systems. So, like, convert CBDC to cash or to commercial bank deposits or whatever it may be, right? Other things you have to consider, right? Um, the next one is increased payments diversity. And so they're explicitly saying and cited here with I am not even sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name. Um, I don't speak, I'm assuming French. I don't know. Sorry, I'm not too familiar with with that kind of naming scheme. I took a lot of German, and that was pretty much it. Um, so, anyways, a CBDC system could avoid these private winner takes all networks, achieving a monopoly through providing demanding interoperability through providing slash demanding interoperability between them, right? So different private networks. So if they were to have different, so you have multiple entities or different um, private providers providing a, say, processing service, right, to process transactions, right? Whether that maybe that's a kind of like a clearinghouse or whatever, as an example, right? So basically, demanding that they are interoperable and whatever happens between those two or between entities that maybe kind of like what commercial banks are now. Say, like if you bank with Bank of America and then you're buying or you're transacting with another person who banks with JP Morgan or whatever. And so, kind of a similar idea with the central bank digital currencies, like that system still has to work to where you can deal with someone who banks with a different bank, right? Or whatever this case may be, right? So this has to be, and it also has to be in such a way that you don't just have one bank, right? To where kind of the intermediaries kind of monopolize in a way, right? So in a tiered CBDC ecosystem, the more diverse the private intermediaries are, uh, the more likely there would be overlapping system or network memberships, creating competition, choice for users, and efficiency in the system. Right. So I guess kind of going more of a free market capitalistic route. Um, However, with it being in the topic of a central bank digital currency, I don't know how that kind of meshes well conceptually, but anyways, continuing on. However, a broad range of intermediaries may also lead to unclear responsibilities, a higher likelihood of failures, operational or financial, and user disruption, right? So, less communication, or it would be more difficult to communicate, right? Kind of like the argument during the kind of crafting, I guess you could say, of the Federal Reserve Act. So, one of the kind of proposed kind of systems for the district banks, like the district reserve banks, was to have, I think one of them was upwards of 50, like 50 different districts, and where each one had their own reserve bank, and then they would also have some technicalities on how their reserves themselves were counted. So it essentially create 50 different central banks that were independent completely and would compete with one another, which was not the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve Act, was not to have the reserve banks compete, right? That was not something they wanted. So that was a argument that Paul Warburg came in and was really like, no, they need to be much less than 50. I think he advocated for 4 or 5, something like that. However, with the actual Reserve Act itself, it said it was more than 8, or it was at least 8 and not less than 12, or it was between 8 and 12. Like you could have 8 to 12, and then you could restructure the districts and or add new districts up to the max and min of 8 to 12, right? But sorry, that's kind of getting into a rabbit hole, but kind of what I'm meaning with the competition and everything else to where they would compete essentially each other out of business in a way. Um, Kind of going that way. And if one thing you've noticed how each one of these kind of considerations are going, there's always it's a cost benefit analysis for each one. So it's really like trying to show it's like, hey, we could do this one, but here are the pros and cons of it, and so on, right? So it's really trying to grasp different ideas and sides of it and trying to understand what's the cost benefit analysis of doing this a certain way or this a certain way, right? Excuse me. Okay. So the next one is financial inclusion, and this one I talked about a little bit more in one of the first CBDC videos. Um, Basically talking about how that having a CBDC would help with unbanked people to a certain degree. Um, However, they would have to basically the technological considerations involved. They would have to make them able to use it, right? It would really depend on how they'd structure it, right? And so would it literally just be like a card that you have that you tap to pay, or like a flash drive that you could transact somehow, but you have to make that in such a way that people know how to use it so they can use it? Because the more kind of, I guess, technologically advanced you get, some people just don't want to learn how to use it, or whatever the case may be. Again, there's billions of people in the world, so who knows what situations could come up, right? So essentially, increasing digitalization could create financial inclusion issues as barriers around trust, literacy, and access to IT and data privacy concerns create a digital divide. And this is kind of where I was going with this digital divide, and the digital literacy is kind of where I was going with, like, people not knowing how to use it and that kind of thing, right? Like, can people use it? And then there's the privacy concerns that they talk about, well, which also get talked about more in depth later, right? So, private payment services, intermediaries naturally have an incentive to cater to users likely to generate the most profit. Therefore, an ecosystem in which the public could only access CBDC through private intermediaries might struggle to achieve universal access or services for all relevant use cases, right, including everybody, right? So, to overcome this, a central bank or other public body, a post office or government bank, could offer services. Legislation requiring basic access could be proposed, and or incentives for private intermediaries to supply otherwise underserved end users could be introduced, right? The word I was forgetting about earlier was and never mind, it just went again. Subsidy. That's where I was going at earlier. Earlier in the video when I was talking about, like, I couldn't quite get the word with, like, how to incentivize private. The government can provide some form of subsidy. That for some reason that word just completely skipped my mind. Um, but yes, so basically forcing everyone to be included, right? And so, what's the cost benefit analysis for that? That's the whole reason why it's a consideration, right? So if you want to have an argument about that, do it in the comments, I guess, because that would be one. It's one of the ones I was confused at first on kind of where they were going with it, because I never really understood before I started reading this stuff where they were like why people don't just go get a bank account to a certain degree. Because there were some things to where it kind of made sense, um, but again, we've talked about that previously, and I don't. That's not the purpose of this video. Right. And so another major thing for central bank digital currencies is improving cross-border payments. Right. And so basically, their hope is that this would provide a clean slate that would reduce some of the frictions in the current cross-border payments kind of system. Right. So basically, transacting in foreign countries with a CBDC, how would this work, and so on. Right. But this also I have to keep in mind anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing, stuff that they bring up every time we talk about, it seems, crypto or money in general, right? It's a major concern all the time. It doesn't matter how much oversight happens. Separate topic, right? And part of the reason why this interoperability discussion is so big is, again, you have different technical standards for different countries. There's different laws, oversight frameworks are different, things like that that really kind of muck up payment systems or just systems in general, I guess. Um, so another thing to keep in mind, right? So in terms of privacy, so they've talked about quite a few things, not just like Basically, they argue that it can't be totally anonymous um, for the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing, whatever. Um, Part of it, they don't want it to be totally anonymous, and so there has to be some form of oversight and tracking, so to speak, right? And so basically, one of the major questions that they've been asking is the CBDC system. Um, it would have to be designed to determine who exactly would have access to what information, kind of going from there. Um, so they talk about yet concentration of end user data may nonetheless raise concerns among the public, even if privacy safeguards were in place. Beyond the central bank, end user identities could be stored by intermediaries subject to the rules imposed in the system. Again, they didn't really talk too much in depth with the rules. Higher level of privacy and restrictions beyond those required by the jurisdiction's data regulation may negatively impact intermediaries' revenue streams and their ability to add new innovative products, potentially reducing the diversity of participants in the system. Right. So kind of jabbing at private enterprise again, right? Let's see. So in one of the footnotes, they give a citation to, I guess, Euler and Buma, or however you pronounce it. Um, Basically, a hybrid architecture where the central bank would retain a copy of all user CBDC holdings, allowing it to act as a technical backstop to the system. Right? And so they just hold it safe. They just hold it in a safe, or obviously not literally, but basically keep it safe just in case the system failed and you needed to get your stuff out or whatever. Um, and this is where digital identity systems come in and where they can play an important role. um, However, financial inclusion and universal access to central bank money motivations, including the possibility for use of foreign travelers, could require other identification means even where a digital identity was in place, right? So I guess like facial recognition or maybe the biometrics we talked about before that was referenced in we talked about in the previous video because it was referenced before in the report, right? And I actually highlighted it and pointed out where that was, right? So talking about different laws and stuff like that. And so there's kind of three questions regarding privacy that the central banks are trying to answer. And that's really what data is to be protected, from whom is it to be protected, and to what degree is it to be protected, right? And so kind of what they're saying is information about the payment could reveal personal information about the payee, whether it be like their wealth. So, like if you're buying a Corvette or whatever, it kind of tells a lot of, or doesn't. I don't know if it tells a lot, but it tells you to what degree, like your wealth that you have, or other luxury items, or possibly even health issues when you're buying medicine, right? And so it kind of, I don't know if it would be like accidentally giving information, right? So people could kind of figure out a lot about you by what you buy, right? Maybe like what you eat, where you go, things like that. So privacy could be protected from the payment parties, at least with respect to their identities, against the issuer of the money, the payment slash network provider slash processors, the regulator and supervisor, the government or third parties, basically against anybody. Regarding the degree of data protection, information could be kept anonymous, pseudo anonymous, or confidential. And then, so like we kind of talked about a little bit earlier with anonymous or pseudo anonymous, to where like maybe it's like your name's not there or whatever. Like you're just kind of some profile without a name, or however else you want to do that, or confidential, right? So, and then it talks a little bit about cryptography and stuff like that, and getting that involved possibly as well. Then, kind of for a final note, and this is kind of what I've heard from other people, what seems to be kind of, or what they think will be the main driver for a CBDC is basically government transfer payments, right? UBI in some form, right? Universal basic income. And so they have a little bit of a, excuse me, um, paragraph here to talk about it. basically it would be much easier to do transfer payments, your stimmy checks, and so on. Basically, they would just deposit it straight into your account, and because you would have an account with them specifically, and they wouldn't have to go through, say, they wouldn't have to go through the member banks or whoever you're banking with to give you your stimmy check, right? You basically just show up. Now, there could be a timestamp on it, there could be a limit on how long you had to use it, things like that, and that's not just me touting things off, that's all things that are explicitly stated within these reports that we have gone over in previous videos as well. So, putting that out there as well, they could put caps on how much you could spend, within a certain amount of time, something again, they talked about in the reports themselves, so putting that out there too. But anyways, I'm gonna leave that one there. So it ran a little bit longer than I was expecting. So, anyways, yeah, I'm gonna leave it. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you.